Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Jacobson, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the popular ongoing presidential series created by historian J.B. Andersen. Today is the third in the series, focusing on James Madison, our fourth president. Today's program is brought to you through the Ramsey County Libraries in our co-sponsorship with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. We're deeply grateful for this cooperation. And now I'm going to turn things over to our speaker, J.B. Andersen.
Okay. We had worked on Madison and major legislation that he was supporting. And there were a total of 4 items. We did 3. And the 4th one we'll begin with today. And that is the Bill of Rights. And this was a tremendous debate among founding fathers as to should the Bill of Rights be part of the body of the Constitution? Should it be in the form of amendments, which is the notion that won, which is considered kind of unfortunate because it's a bit easier to change them as a result. But at any rate, the role that Madison played in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, is extraordinary. He actually had a total of 12 of them, but in 1791, 2 years after George Washington had become president and after the Constitution had been adopted, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were passed. So that's 1791. Most of these things were, these amendments were proposed by state legislatures. So the 13 colonies, now the 13 states, sent their ideas to Madison. And Madison was concerned about some things that didn't show up. And we're going to talk about 3 of those now. One was freedom of the press, which is interesting because it's certainly considered a fundamental freedom today, but none of the states had proposed freedom of the press. The press wasn't a big deal yet, I mean, there were newspapers around the country, mostly only in the largest cities, and so it was something to be overlooked or easily overlooked at any rate. And Madison said, I'm going to add freedom of the press to the 12 amendments that he was proposing. Then there were some restrictions on the federal government. Madison was a big supporter of a strong federal government, but a lot of people, most famously Thomas Jefferson, were not. Slaveholders generally were not in favor of a strong federal government. So Madison added something that restricted the federal government, and it was along the lines of the seizure of property. So you can't just go in and say, we're taking over your property and we're going to give it to the railroads, because they need a line right through where you're living. Or it's unreasonable searches. This is part of the 4th Amendment today. So you can't just walk into someone's territory, property, and start searching. You need to get a court order in order to do that. And you have to give reasons or a reason for the search so that it's not unreasonable. You can't just show up at somebody's door and say, we're going to have a look around. And the third item that was not included by the states that Madison included was the right to a trial by a jury. So those 3 things got added by Madison. First 10 amendments were approved on December 10th of 1791, the last state necessary to approve the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments did so. Congressional districts, there were 2 amendments now. There were 10 that got passed, 2 that didn't. So there were a total of 12 that had been proposed by Madison. One of them that did not pass was the size of congressional districts. Madison wanted them at 40,000 people. Washington wanted them at 30,000. So there would be more people in the House of Representatives under Washington's plan than under Madison's. So where are you going to set the limit became an issue. Madison and Washington were friends. They got along with each other very well, and they eventually got this worked out. One of the big issues for the size of a congressional district was how can a candidate for the House of Representatives get in touch with people in his district? Many districts were rural. They didn't even have a newspaper. Others were urban. The larger areas had newspapers. So that was a way you could write a letter to the newspaper. You could have an article published in the newspaper. People would gather in the town square. Many could not read. A person who was literate would read the newspaper out loud in the town square. And so that was the method of communicating in the 1790s with your constituents, was by print material only. So Washington's concern was, we got to keep this smaller in a congressional district, like 30,000 people per district, because that'll make it easier for the person running or the people running for the House of Representatives to indeed get information out to their constituents. Population grew over the next several decades, the next 130 years. In 1790, when Congress began, it had 105 members, and this is the House of Representatives, that aspect of Congress. Senate was 2 senators from each state. So 1790, 105 members in the House of Representatives. 130 years later, in 1920, with 30 to 40,000 people in a district, the House of Representatives had grown to 432 members. People were worried about the size of the House of Representatives. The solution was the Permanent Appropriation Act, the Permanent Apportionment Act. Thanks. Limited House to 435 members, so you couldn't have more than 435 ever. Consequently, each House of Representatives district would grow larger and larger by population, and that is precisely what's happened since 1929, when we were running at 30 to 40,000 people. Now, in 2020, we're averaging 760,000 people in a congressional district. Some are larger, some are smaller. There are some states that don't have that many people. They have a single representative in the House. So at any rate, for roughly 100 years here, we've maintained a House of Representatives with 435 representatives. Consequently, congressional districts have grown. every 10 years, there's a census is taken in the United States. The reason for that census is to redraw lines for congressional districts so they're all about equal in population size. And then you've got a representative for each of those districts. They're still talking about this First Amendment that didn't get passed. With 30,000 people in East District today, or at least in the 2020 census, the House of Representatives would have 11,000 members. I mean, yikes. The British Parliament only has like a little over 600. This stadium here will seat 50 or 60,000, so that's huge compared to the 11,000 members that would be in the House. But at any rate, you can see how gigantic the House of Representatives could have grown to be had we stuck with a constant figure in each congressional district. Instead, we limited them to 435, and they grow in numbers as a result. Today, there's compared to the 1790s when there were newspapers only, and that not everyone had a newspaper. They couldn't afford them. Many couldn't read. There wasn't a newspaper in their area, etc. So today, it's gotten very costly due to the electronics that have come about. There are a lot of countries that require the electronic communication industry, like television, radio, etc. They require that you give political candidates free time. Now, that's not true in the United States. Political ads have to pay the channels, mostly the larger channels like ABC, NBC, so on. They have to pay them an amount of money, and it's gigantic. A 30-second TV ad this year in 2024 can run between $200,000 and $1 million each time you run it. And it depends on the time of day. Prime time viewing in the evening, you're going to pay $1 million. In the morning when people are getting up and heading out to work and so on, you'll pay far less than that, or a small percentage of it. So at any rate, campaigns have become very expensive. The presidency of the United States pays about $400,000 a year. A 4-year term is $1.6 million. Last presidential election, the two major candidates spent $1 billion. What the heck is going on? You get a job that's going to pay you $1.6 million, and the two parties spend $1 billion running for that office. So, continuing with the Second Amendment that did not pass, that is congressional pay raises. And what this second non-passing amendment is if you vote for a pay raise for the House of Representatives, you can't have that begin until the next congressional session begins. So you may not be voting to increase a salary that you will be able to share. You may not run in that next election, or you may lose your seat in the election, so on. So there was this desire to have congressional pay raises not take effect until after the election for the next Congress. Now there's no time. There was also no time limit on the passage of amendments. You know, today we get an amendment going and we say, okay, this has to be approved within 7 years or it's dead. That wasn't done back in the 1790s. No limit was placed on the passage of amendments. Today, just 7 years is common. The ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, which would have given a lot more rights to women, for instance, did not get approved before that limit ran out. They managed to get the limit increased, but it still didn't get approved, even with an increase in the amount of time allotted for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. In 1982, a university student named Craig Watson was taking a class, probably in political science, and learned about this amendment where pay raises cannot take place until the next congressional term begins. And there was no limit ever placed on that. So he started a movement to get that 1790s amendment approved. And it was indeed passed 10 years after he began the effort in 1992. It's now the 27th Amendment, and it states if you vote a pay raise for the House of Representatives, it cannot take effect until after the next House elections. Factions. These are political parties. We're going to talk about them next. They were called factions back in Madison's day, in the early days of the United States government. So today they're called political parties, and we're going to talk about the divisions first. There were two factions in the 1790s, the Democratic Party and the Federalist Party. And they each had these symbols that you see here. They're called fans. They're circular. And you can fold them down so that they're much smaller. The red one represented the Democratic Party in the 1790s, and the black one represented the Federalist Party. Now, these aren't fans, you know, they don't have a stick on them. They aren't anything you wave in front of your face. But that came to be called the term that these symbols for the Democrats and the Federalists came to be called. Let's take a look at the Democratic Party first. The major people involved in the leadership of the Democratic Party at this time was Thomas Jefferson on the right, and on the left, James Madison. Here's what the Democrats wanted: no monarchies. They wanted to support the French Revolution. Big debate was England would be a much better trade partner, but France has gotten rid of its monarchy. And that's something the United States did too when it won independence from England. No longer was there a monarch. Also, they wanted strong states' rights. They wanted a pro-slavery stance. They wanted democracy that was made up primarily of land-owning farmers. Manufacturing companies they didn't like so much, saw them as a threat to liberty. You got to have people owning land and working and living on the land that they do indeed own. The major members of the Federalist Party, pictured here, are Alexander Hamilton on the right and John Adams on the left. Many people will include George Washington in this also, but we have built up a myth around George Washington that he was non-political, and he was doing a great job of keeping everybody happy, etc. The reality is, I believe it, many other people do, that Washington was indeed a federalist, believed in a strong federal government. Federalist Party issues, strong federal government. International trade, as opposed to siding with countries that were getting rid of monarchies, rather we would side with countries that could benefit our trade. And Britain was the big trade partner in Europe and North America at that time. So this party, this Federalist Party, as a result of wanting to side with Britain due to trade, was backed by wealthy Northerners. These were people who controlled the banks, and they controlled, and they were individuals who had a great deal of wealth also. The Federalist Party also supported a national bank that could control currency and other major financial issues. Democrats see Federalists. They're a threat to democracy. They want to establish a monarchy. John Adams told people when he was president, "I am to be called Your Highness," which was a term generally reserved for royalty. So the Democratic Party, John Adams in particular, was leaning very much toward a monarchy, and certainly toward a nobility. And many will argue that that is indeed what we have today, is we have a class of wealth. Now, Hamilton's report. Hamilton wrote a report about these issues, these factions. Let's take a look at it. Here is the book, Report of the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States on the subject of manufactures. So this is considered the major work by Hamilton. What's amazing about it is most people have never heard of it. It's not like the Federalist Papers, which have had a large following and are reasonably well known among the general population. So this is Hamilton's big work, and it's all about manufacturing and siding with manufacturers as opposed to land owning small farmers, which is what Thomas Jefferson wanted. Here's Alexander Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers. You can buy it today. This particular book cover that you see here is available on Amazon. And what he talks about in here is, first of all, money, making money. Not making it for your own personal reason, but manufacturing money. And he says that about $25 should be in hard currency, that's coins. And it's usually got a precious metal in it, like gold or silver, or later on copper. Then at $12, that's roughly a little less than half of what the hard currency is, can be paper. And of course, paper has no value, not like a coin that contains a precious metal does. And then $6 of it, today we'd say it's electronic. Here in the 1790s, this was money that could just simply be stored away, not printed, but considered to be something that could be made available. This report, historians generally refer to as the the greatest single written work by a founding father. And that's Hamilton making arguments for manufacturing companies. Of course, this was a major advantage to New England, where manufacturing occurred. The South was agricultural. Support and encourage the growth of industry. There's 5 points here that we're going to talk about that come about from Hamilton's report on manufacturing. First, support the growth of industry. Now, the Democrats were support the growth of small landowning farmers. Second item in Hamilton's report is to regulate foreign trade. And this was done by establishing a tariff. A tariff is a tax, and it's a tax on goods coming into the United States from a foreign country. So here in the United States, the manufacturing firms could make clothing, but they couldn't make it as inexpensively as England did. So in order to get the price of the English clothing up to where it was competitive at the same level as clothing made in the United States, a tax was placed on that clothing coming in from foreign countries, England in particular. And they didn't want to discourage trade, but they wanted to make sure that these foreign imports were at a competitive price level with American manufactured goods. Also, how are we going to run a federal government? Taxation was not allowed. Individual taxation, income taxation, that was not passed until during the William Howard Taft administration. And once an income tax amendment got passed to the Constitution, it was stated that it would take effect in 1913. Frequently, Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats get blamed for this because they say, well, the taxes started under a Democratic president. Yes, but it was a Republican Congress and a Republican president that got the amendment adopted. The fact of when it started was simply one of the requirements in the amendment. Subsidize industries. This would aid in their growth. You can see there's a favorability here to manufacturing. As a matter of fact, there's been a tremendous amount of that sort of favorability throughout U.S. history. It really began day one. So industries are going to aid the United States in growth and in the amount of wealth that they have. Consequently, industries deserve rewards. Take a look at this. This is 2020. These are bailouts to companies. Now, there were a total of 998 corporations that received federal money. Here are the top 10. AIG, which is an insurance company, $68 billion. Citicorp, a bank. Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo. Go down to number 8, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. The leading recipients in 2020 of bailout money, or just a gift of money from the federal government, were banks. The leading recipient was an insurance company, AIG, and you can see also number 10 there and number 6 are financial institutions. And you can see the top 10 here go from $68 billion down to $8 billion worth of gifts from federal government. The total in 2020 was $263 billion. And that's and that's there. And then there's another 988 other than these top 10 that you see here who received bailouts also. 3, subsidies reduce prices. Okay, if these companies have money that they get from the federal government, that's money they don't have to come up with and spend. And that means that they can be selling their goods for less money. The industry will grow, but the amount of money that the industry has to charge, if it had to come up with that money itself, will be far less. So frequently there were infrastructure projects that the federal government aided in also, and those companies that built those roads and canals would receive bailout money to aid in that. Now, of course, lots of people say that these subsidies don't reduce prices. They improve profit margins, but now there's other argument that's used in Hamilton's report is that by financing industries, aiding industries, we improve employment opportunities. This encourages immigration, which encourages the growth of the United States, which was something they wanted. The bigger you are, the less likely you are to be attacked by somebody else. So size kind of mattered here in the 1790s, and emigration was encouraged. Sound any different from today? These policies also would encourage research. How can we find new products? How can we get them manufactured? What new products do people need? How can we convince people they need such a new product? So lots of aid to industries, but lots of aid also to agricultural institutions. Hamilton's report. Let's take a look at the reactions to this. Congress accepted it. They thought it was great. Democrats, led by Jefferson, had lots of concerns about Hamilton boosting up the manufacturing industries in the new United States. These subsidies that are being given to corporations are going to lead to corruption, was the argument of the Democratic Party under Jefferson. And of course, a lot of that corruption came in the form of congressmen seeing to it that industries within their territory, their jurisdiction, would indeed get a major portion of that money. A worry? There would be favoritism to certain industries, certain individuals. The 2020 report I showed you a few slides ago was mostly banking industry. That I think it was 6 out of the 10 biggest recipients of federal aid were banks. So this favoritism that the Democrats became worried about is exactly what happened. The subsidies in reality, they didn't lead to higher wages, they didn't lead to lower prices, they led to greater profits, they led to more wealth, and they led to higher prices. These subsidies are most notable among railroads. At one time, or over the course of the building of railroads, land owned by the federal government was given to railroad companies to build the track on. And at one point during the 1800s, 1/4 of all United States land was owned by railroads. The railroad would submit, here's where we're going to build the track. Federal government would say, okay, 10 miles on each side of that track, you get that land free of charge, we're giving it to you. And then a decade or two later, it was increased to 20 miles on each side of that railroad track. And you can see here, I want to go to the next page where I've got a larger image. Look at Minnesota here. Holy mackerel. I mean, it's half the state was land owned by railroads. And look here, this is James J. Hill running a railroad out to the Pacific Ocean. And look at the huge width of land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad. You can also see here in the Midwest, there was lots of land. All of this got started. I mean, look on the East Coast, see. Once they realized how expensive this was getting, then by the time they get to the Midwest and the far West, the land is being given away, these federal land grants. In addition to the land, the federal government agreed to pay for the building of the track. And railroad companies would receive $16,000 for every mile of flatland track that they laid. Anything on a hill, you'd get 32,000 miles, or $32,000 per mile. Anything through a tunnel, you'd get $48,000 per mile if you had to dig a tunnel. Amazingly, when the money came in and when the railroads sent claims to the federal government, they were right there, $16,000 for, that's what it cost us to lay this railroad track per mile on flat land, etc. But very interesting. And you can see these northern states were the kind of the place where population was heading, and then across like this. Whereas these southern states were just, they weren't, the climate, generally speaking, was not good for farming, and consequently, less railroad was needed. So being near a railroad was a big advantage to farmers too, and to manufacturing companies. So they would buy up that land that had been given free to railroads, and then they'd only have maybe a mile where they had to deliver their product to get it on a railroad and taken to far off places. That was true for agricultural products and manufactured products. And the railroads that had then received this land at no cost to them were able to sell it at a big price, because you're not going to have to pack up a lot of wagons and drive 30 miles to get to the site of a railroad. You can live very near the railroad itself. These railroads were built by low-paid Chinese. Now, frequently you'll hear people say Chinese, and they mean Asian. I do not mean Asians generally here. These workers that built the railroad, these immigrant laborers, were from the nation of China. And here's a picture of a group of Chinese workers who had been laying track for the railroad there. Democrats start a newspaper that's in opposition to a lot of this stuff, known as the National Gazette. And they argue people can govern themselves. We don't need a big fancy federal government. We don't need government interference in industry, etc. And here is this National Gazette. This is a copy from April 12th of 1792. And you can see it's in English. And the Democrats put this out, and it favored their policies. You know, today we say we want a free and open press. We don't want them giving us lots of opinions unless it's on the opinion page so we know what it is, etc. That was not true in the early decades of the United States. There are newspapers like, I'm making this up, but the Cincinnati Democrat. See, that meant we support Democratic Party politics. There might have been the Albany Republican. My wife is from the town of St. James in southern Minnesota, 4,000 people. Its newspaper to this day is called the St. James Plain Dealer, meaning they're not taking sides in Democrat versus Federalist or Democrat versus Republican issues. Jefferson was so outraged by what had happened with a lot of this stuff that he resigned from Washington's cabinet as a protest against free land and paying for the building of railroads, the construction of water canals, etc. So there were a lot of industrialists who didn't like this stuff either. They wanted high tariffs on imports. They didn't want just a tariff that would make their products competitive with foreign products. They wanted a tariff that was so high on foreign products that nobody would want to buy the foreign product. So industrialists begin to move away from the Federalist Party because they see you're not giving enough aid to business. They moved on into the Democratic Party, and this started to lead to the dissolution of the Federalist Party. Jefferson began a movement to let's really take care of the farmers. Give me a second here. Let's take care of the farmers. We need an agricultural-based economy. You can't have a democracy without land-owning farmers who are small in business. And Madison, when he became president, brought on much higher tariffs to give greater support to industries within the United States. Now, 1793, French people rise up against their nobility, kill off a lot of the nobility, including the king and the queen, who were beheaded. So it's 1793, French Revolution, when a company or a country that you're in competition with, like Britain is with France, they start having internal problems. That's the perfect time to attack them. So you got the nobility and the monarchy fighting with the common folks. They are having troubles among themselves. So then Britain comes in and attacks in the hope of taking over all of France. The Federalist Party supported Britain. They liked the trade. The Democrats supported France. They liked the anti-monarchy part. Party disagreements began to become more to the front, and they change in nature. Party disagreements had pretty much been economic in nature. They now, during the French Revolution, become political in nature also. Jay's Treaty, this is a treaty with Britain that ended the War of 1812. Madison did not support it. He wanted to side with the French Revolution. He wanted to see monarchies overthrown. Jay's Treaty was a trade treaty with Britain, precisely the country we'd won our independence from, who to this day still has a monarch, although with far less power. Hamilton's report, 1791, for decades afterwards, there was a great deal of support for Hamilton's report. In the 1840s, Henry Clay regularly talked about it and tried to enforce what Hamilton had written about. The Whig Party, which existed from about 1833 to 1856, the Whig Party became a big supporter of the Hamilton report. Then Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s started with gigantic subsidies to railroads. They'd been going on, but they really improved dramatically. And a lot of this under Lincoln was also dealing with slavery. You know, if you could get away from an agricultural-based economy and move to a manufacturing-based economy, there was less likelihood of slavery continuing. Here's a Whig Party symbol. Whigs to the rescue, and you can see they early on have an eagle for a symbol. Their motto was they couldn't possibly be worse, meaning worse than their fellow politicians and other political parties. Whigs were politically conservative, opposed to slavery. When the Whig Party started to fall apart, they pretty much, including Abraham Lincoln, ran to the newly founded Republican Party, founded in 1854. 1796 election. John Adams is the major candidate, and he's in the Federalist Party. Washington has served 2 terms. He has said, I don't want to serve any more than 2 terms. He's kind of set that standard then. Now, Madison, he's opposed to Adams. Adams is real big on a strong federal government, and he's way too liberal for Madison. So Madison gets Jefferson to run for the Democratic Party in 1796. So you got John Adams running against Thomas Jefferson. Adams wins the election. Here are the 2 candidates. You can see the popular vote for Adams, 36,000. For Jefferson, 31,000. The percent of the popular vote was 53.4 to 46.6, difference of about 7 points. Today, we consider a landslide victory to be a 5% margin or larger. So you can see this is about a 7% margin. So Adams really wins big with the vote here over Jefferson. In the Electoral College, it's 71 electoral votes for Adams, which is a majority of the votes, and 68 for Jefferson. However, there were a whole lot of other people that were running. Look at this, 59 electoral votes went to Thomas Pinckney. Aaron Burr, a famous name, he got 30. Samuel Adams, who headed the militia group that really fought long and hard against the British, and was a distant cousin to John Adams. He got 15 votes. Ellsworth, Clinton, John Jay, who became the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, received 7 votes. You can see George Washington, who said, "I'm not going to run," got 2 electoral votes. And there's 3 other guys there with a couple of votes apiece. And so it's quite a list of candidates. And look at they all received electoral votes. So they were winning in some states. Madison did not seek re-election to office in 1796. He said the heck with it and returned to his estate, pictured here in Virginia. So you can see the mansion there with a crowd of people waiting to go in and have a look at it. And here's an interior of Madison's home. Note to chess set. This was something that became a kind of a big deal, because the goal of chess is to capture the king. So now can you see the difference between the nobility monarchy movement and the rule of the people kind of movement? You're capturing the king. Madison during the John Adams presidency. Okay, you got John Adams gets elected president. Madison chose not to run for political office. What's the situation? Madison's holding no office, but he's very critical of John Adams, who is the president, and he's able to speak out as a private citizen. Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, got them through Congress by the Federalist Party, and this became a gigantic issue and created a tremendous amount of tension, these Alien and Sedition Acts that Adams supported. It dealt Adams' first concern was, you're in this country now, you're a French immigrant, and you're making comments about policies concerning the French Revolution. You have a vested interest in that because you came from France. So if you start speaking out about supporting France, as opposed to Britain, say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is we're going to send you back to France. Alien and Sedition Acts. These are alien people, French immigrants. They are being seditious. They're telling the United States who to support and who not to support based on where they came from. Here is a Louisiana paper. Louisiana was settled largely by French people, and you can see this newspaper in Louisiana is in the French language. Pennsylvania, almost everybody in Pennsylvania spoke German. Here's a Philadelphia newspaper. The whole thing is in German, written up in German. Interesting thing was a congressman from Pennsylvania introduced a bill that German become the official language of the United States. He introduced that in the 1790s. It failed by 1 vote, or we could have had an official language. Think of how that might have changed 20th century history. Think about the wars, World War I, World War II. All of a sudden, the U.S. is a German-speaking nation. In the 2020s, by comparison, here's Muslim countries and Eastern or Middle Eastern countries here. And they move into the United States, as many have. They start newspapers that are against U.S. policies from their homeland countries. And this is what Adams was concerned about with French people who had emigrated to the United States. He wanted to shut them up. Today, it would be like saying Muslims, Middle Eastern immigrants, you can't have a newspaper. You can't support your home country notions. Let's take a look at Central America. Central American immigrants coming into the United States, having Spanish language newspapers, critical of policies about issues south of the border. Here are these Central American nations. I don't include Mexico there because geographically speaking, Mexico is a part of North America. Then you got Central America and South America. So even though Spanish is the language spoken in Mexico, and even though that's a more common language all throughout Central and South America, with the exception of Brazil, where Portuguese is the official language. At any rate, there's concern about looking at it from the perspective of today, great concerns about immigrants coming from Central America and Northern South American countries and creating newspapers critical of policies. Alien and Sedition Act, Madison said, this act is against the Constitution. You're telling people that they can't speak. They can't have freedom of the press. They can't have freedom of speech. It's a difficulty for a democracy. So here's Louis the 14th, the major big king of France throughout its history. And this Alien and Sedition Act, it's a sign of support by Adams for the French monarchy. You know, he was having himself called Your Highness. He wasn't interested in trade with Britain. He was interested in becoming more like France and having a monarchy within the United States. And these Alien and Sedition Acts aided Adams in meeting those goals. Adams justifies some of this stuff. He says the French are seizing U.S. ships, so let's limit their speech in the United States. They're taking over ships of ours that are privately owned. We didn't have much of a navy at the time, maybe 5 ships, but we're trying to protect privately owned trade vessels sailing back and forth. And so Adams now has a law that will allow him to take the side of a nation or be against a nation, and the freedom of speech of immigrants from that nation, the freedom of the press, etc. Such limits have been enacted throughout United States history, especially during times of war. World War I is a classic example. There was a law passed during World War I that butted up very nicely against the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that was you could not speak out against U.S. involvement in World War I. And of course, a lot of Germans wanted to do that, German immigrants. The entire state of Pennsylvania was still largely German ancestry. The lower right photo is Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was a socialist, and ran with the Socialist Party. He spoke out against U.S. involvement in World War I, was tried and convicted of sedition against the United States, and he was in prison during the 1920 election, and he ran for president, and he got 3.4% of the popular vote. This is an issue today. What if Trump gets convicted of a crime and gets a prison sentence? Can he run for president? Well, we have an example of that happening. Madison responds to Adams. Madison says the reason Adams supports these laws is because then he can suspend anybody's rights. And no president should have that kind of authority. No person within this new democracy we've created. It's a danger to the democracy. It's a danger to the new United States. These laws, these Alien and Sedition Acts, are horrible. Next up, Madison during the John Adams presidency. This is the election of 1800. Now, Adams is going to run for a second term. So Madison decides, okay, I'm going to get back into this politically. He decides he's going to run for a seat in the House of Representatives because he wants to have a stronger voice against John Adams, and he feels like he can have that if he's an official of the U.S. government. Running for president in 1800 is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The report of 1800. Here it is, the Virginia Report. And it focuses on alien and sedition laws and the Virginia resolutions. You can see here it's issued in December of 1798, and it is in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts that Adams had gotten passed, and that's what we've been discussing here. This is a lengthy book for the time, 264 pages, and it's written by Madison, and it's about how egregious these Alien and Sedition Acts are and what incredible power they had given to John Adams as president. Jefferson told Adams when Madison. Jefferson told Madison when Madison was writing this book, he said, you've got to have something in there about federal laws and states being allowed to say, we're not going to follow that federal law. Now, let's make a comparison today. Donald Trump, just in the last couple of days, has said abortion is a state issue. Let the states decide it. Here we are, 220 years ago, same issue. But Madison refused to write about states being allowed to void federal laws, as Jefferson had requested. Madison's physical and social characteristics. Let's get off of the politics for a minute or two. He was a shorty, 5'4", shortest president in the history of the United States, known as Short Jimmy. And that's an all-time record. The all-time record for tallest president is Abraham Lincoln, who was a foot taller than Madison at 6 feet 4 inches. Madison weighed less than 100 pounds, weighed about 98 pounds. Not this kind of a pound, but here are a couple of 100-pound notes from England. So they're technically, talk about them as 100 pounds, they weigh more than Madison did. Madison weighed less than 100 pounds. My right leg weighs more than 100 pounds. I could pick this guy up and toss him across the Potomac River, just as Washington did with the silver dollar, supposedly. Here is a drawing of Madison, and here's what it would look like actual size. I've eaten Tootsie Rolls bigger than Madison. Madison had blue eyes, and they were blazing, and his wife did too, and that got him a lot of attention. I mean, people were fixed on him because these eyes were amazing. They weren't pale blue; they were bright and blazing. He had a loud and clear voice, which was an absolute necessity in this day and age. He was very well spoken. There were no microphones. There were no speakers yet. Nothing electronic. You get 300 people that come to listen to you speak, and they have to hear you from the power of your own voice, from how much air you can take into your lungs. And the fact that Madison was very good at this, had a very strong voice, got him a great deal of attention. He had a pleasant sense of humor, so that also during his speeches, audiences would laugh. It would just make the whole thing a whole lot more personable. We can hear this guy, and he's funny. He had hypochondria. He was constantly complaining about diseases that he had, which he didn't have. So these are false ailments. He tired regularly. He's constantly telling people, I got to go take a nap, or fall asleep on a sofa talking to a group of people. Lived to be 85 years old, actually had no serious illnesses throughout his life, but certainly thought that he did. I got 59 slides on Dolley Madison. I'm kind of thinking it might be nice to start those next week rather than quit after doing 15 slides. If we have questions now, we can do them. If we have to quit a little early, that's fine. Sound okay out there?
When did the Electoral College switch from multiple people getting Electoral College votes, as in 1796, to winner take all?
That actually has continued throughout U.S. history. There are places like Nebraska, for instance. Now, Nebraska, it'll give you 2 votes if you win the state. And then it'll give you a portion of votes if you win congressional districts. So it would be possible to win 2.5 votes and some other guy wins 3.5 votes. This is called proportional dishing out of the Electoral College votes. So some people say, some states actually say, whoever wins in the state gets all the votes. Other states say, you got 40%, the other guy got 60. We've got 10 electoral votes. So the guy that got gets 4 of them, the other guy gets 6 of them. They split it that way. Then you have states that are, for each congressional district that you win, you get a vote. You could win, say you got 10 congressional districts in a state. You could win 8 of them, and they are 40% of the population because of gerrymandering. So you get 8 out of the 10 votes in that state, even though what you won were congressional districts that were very small in size based on population. And so we're still doing a variety of things. And of course, in addition, what I'd add on to your question is there's people that want to be rid of the Electoral College altogether. Just base it on popular vote. There have been several incidences through American history, most recently Hillary Clinton, Al Gore. They got more popular votes than their opponents and yet lost the election. My problem with getting rid of the Electoral College, and I've stated this before, is you got some guy in Louisiana who's stuffing a ballot box, and we have an Electoral College. All he's doing is influencing the electoral votes of Louisiana. Okay, now we have no Electoral College anymore. It's based on popular votes. Now the same guy in Louisiana is affecting the national election. Have any other questions come through? I quit early. I got to a breaking point and I thought, well, let's see how many questions there are and we can quit early if need be. But the next section on Dolley Madison is 59 slides. So I would really like to be able to cover her all in one session.
Okay. Yeah, the one thing I noted about the 1796 election, I added up the electoral votes really quickly of the other 9 candidates, and that was 139, and that equaled Jefferson and Adams' electoral votes.
Yes.
It was 139 to 139, just 2 versus the other 9, which was.
Yeah, they did tricky stuff.
Yeah. So, okay, well, before we end, just want to let people know the first 2 sessions are up.
Hey,
yeah.
There's a few more questions that
more questions came in.
One
Yay.
that came in, and also Pete B has something in the chat. He didn't put it in the Q&A, so I just want to make sure you get your questions.
Thank you. Okay, question. Was there much support for Hamilton's National Bank?
Yes. The National Bank existed up until Andrew Jackson's presidency. Jackson was the 7th president, first elected in 1828. So you've got about 38 years or more, roughly 40 years of a national bank in the United States. And it was Andrew Jackson who got rid of it. He didn't like that idea of a strong federal government. He was a huge slave owner, and so yeah, that as the Federalist Party started to wave off, and the Whigs and then the Republicans came about, and wanting a weaker federal government, we ended up in that situation where we started getting rid of things. Probably the 2 major items that brought back federal controls for a while were the Civil War, of course, and then the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, amazingly, lots of legislation that got passed by Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats who controlled Congress after that 1932 election. A tremendous amount of that passage of new laws for recovery, known as the New Deal. As soon as World War II started, the Republicans started undoing all of that. From 1933 to 1941, 90% of all the New Deal legislation was gotten rid of by a Republican-controlled Congress.
Okay, another thing from Pete B, who came in late, but I do remember this from last week. He had wondered if you were going to talk about the influences of George Mason and Robert Morris on the Bill of Rights.
Yes. Yep, that'll come.
Still to come. Okay.
Yeah, Mason is known as the father of the Bill of Rights.
Okay, so we'll talk about that still in these sessions, but later.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that is coming.
Okay.
It
so
could be 2 weeks yet, you know.
Still to come. Okay. And any other questions from anyone? Okay, we still have time. I'm going to give a couple of announcements. The first 2 sessions are now currently up on OLLI's YouTube channel and the library website. So if you've missed something or you want to go back, you can view those. And someone had sent me a question wondering if JB would be doing a part of the summer series, and he will be coming back in the fall. So I just wanted to get that out there. We got to give JB a little bit of vacation, right? So,
Actually, I'll be getting ready for the fall.
yep. Okay, well, seeing as there are no more questions that I'm seeing at this point, we will thank all of you for tuning in. We look forward to next week's session, same time, same place, and it'll be part 4. So everyone have a great week, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.